The college football show from FantasyInsiders.com is live on Spreecast. Catch us also on the iTunes replay, also on YouTube.com. Dan Strafford, Joe DeSalvo, Jordan Case, Ben Pritchett with you. We talked to Ben last week. Ben, welcome back. We are glad to have you here. Find him on Twitter at Natural Slugger. Then we have Jordan Case with us for the first time here in week 2 of college football. Jordan, why don't you introduce yourself, not a stranger to this audience, but certainly where people can find your content and what your content is this year over on Fantasy Insiders.
Yep, I am writing a Vegas article. It's called Inside the Lines, just going over some of the Vegas odds. If they're ever out early enough, we'll cover some player props and just giving a few plays from the games that I like, basically.
Great, Jordan, great to have you on board. And then we move on to the CFF site. Joe DeSalvo joins us, the voice of the CFF site. Of course, a great news site. We heard David Kitchen talking about it previously. But Joe, why don't you give the audience a little bit of your background and what you're hoping to bring to the table here on our college football show.
Yeah, guys, look, I'm excited to join up with you guys. We've been around now going into our 5th year providing just seasonal college fantasy football content. And you know, things couldn't be better right now. And look, with everything happening in DFS right now, not only are we providing good seasonal content for folks, but a lot of DFS players as well are coming over to the site. So it only made sense for us to go ahead and really attach onto you guys and come on board and really get our feet wet in the DFS arena. And so, look, a lot of guys said, hey, Joe, where are you going? You going DFS? Are you staying? We're doing both, guys. Look, we're sort of a crossover right now. So we're going to be in the DFS with you guys, getting our feet wet in that in 2015, and we're still going to do our thing over at the CFF site and provide our season-long content.
Great to have you on board, Joe. And I know Ben last week discussed how he has used your rankings in the past to confirm or deny his pick. So glad to have you on board in an official capacity. And I'm sure Ben is appreciating the access to information as we move forward in the 2015 college season.
Awesome.
So we have week 1 in the books. Ben, let's start with you. I'm going to go around the horn with you guys. Was there a big surprise to you? Was there any storyline that jumped out at you? Something looking back at the results? And we don't want to be results-oriented. We want to look forward. We want to do our best to predict what's going to happen. But were there any results from last weekend that jumped out at you as a little bit of a surprise or something that you felt you were spot on in your write-ups and something you want to call attention to?
Well, I was, first of all, want to thank both these guys for being on here. They make my job a lot easier just having them around and making our college fantasy content top-notch. So kudos to these guys. They're doing a great job so far. But, some surprises. I was shocked to see Washington State go down to Portland State. I don't think anybody in their right mind thought that was going to happen. Portland State was coming into this year ranked in the mid-50s in the FCS, not even a top-tier FCS program anymore. I mean, they used to be, but for that game to play out the way it did, where Washington State only scored 17 points, and they wound up losing that game, that was a huge surprise to me. And I know it hurt some people that had Falk, who got injured late in that game, and some of those receivers. But other ones I wanted to point out, Josh Rosen is the truth. I think that there's no denying that anymore. We all wondered if he would be, and to do that to Virginia was just impressive, and he's already vaulted himself to the front of Heisman conversations, so that's a really big one. And then my last one is always trust your process. And my guy last week was D'Angelo Brewer, and I brought up how he was kind of a bridge. And while he was a bridge, and if you use Brewer, you're able to get the guys in that did well. And he didn't actually work out necessarily, but he managed 92 yards. But they ran the ball 40 times in that fast-paced offense, and they did manage 3 touchdowns. None of them were Brewers. They were all Langers. But the offense is going to run and do a lot of plays and enough to where it's going to support 2 backs for sure.
And we'll get into Saturday's slate and how it was established on both DraftKings and FanDuel and across the industry. Really seems like a bit of a slow process to get these games posted. But Ben, you did mention that it's been a stressful 24 hours and there may be some wine involved tonight. I don't know if that is in fact true. I just want to double check. Are we enjoying? Excellent. We raise our glass to you as well, Ben, and we will continue on here on the show.
Hey, he's
Jordan,
got his
how
own cup.
He does. He's branded. It's well done.
What?
Jordan,
we got the shirt too, guys. We got the shirt.
I'll send you my
all
address,
out, man.
I will send you my address. Share the swag.
Hey, man, we're doing big over here, brother.
Jordan, how about yourself? Any big surprises from week one or storylines that you're keeping track of moving into week two from week one?
Well, Ben touched on it, but Josh Rosen, he's incredible. If any of you guys follow me on Twitter, you'll know what I think of him. I tweet about him every couple hours or so. Other than that, I thought that Oregon's defense, I don't know if it was just like first week knocking off the rust, but they did not look good. Was it Eastern Washington just had their way with them pretty much. Other than that, I thought that Arkansas's offense, that was a nice little change of pace. They decided they wanted to come out and throw the ball last week. And Brandon Allen had, 4 touchdowns through the air? Something like that. So I thought that would be something to keep an eye on going forward. But it was a fun first week overall.
So Joe, from your perspective, from a news perspective, from the tweets you guys send out, from what you do on your website, tracking injuries, tracking the news and notes of college football, are there any storylines to hone in on for week two that may majorly affect DFS and season-long lineups?
Yeah, I think we're going to get into that as we get into the slate. We'll get a lot of injuries, and I think as far as what week one entails, this is something that I think we communicated with each other on our thread earlier in the week. Week one is just very difficult to project. It's probably the most difficult fantasy week to project in the season because you don't get preseason like you do with the NFL. You sort of jump right into the saddle. You're going off of some of these preview magazines. You're going off of what you're hearing out of fall camp. I felt we did pretty good with our rankings, everything considered. And, there's a lot of mismatches on the books in the first couple of weeks, a lot of FBS, FCS, and, even for the daily players as well as the season long as well. The one theme to keep in mind is that you don't want to jump and attach your hitch too soon, and you don't want to jump ship too soon. Keep that in mind, guys. There's a lot of matchups here. There's just mismatches on the book. Some of these starters are only getting, top-tier running backs 8-10 carries the first week. Don't jump ship early, but also don't jump on the bandwagon too quick either. So that's a theme we'll see moving forward here as we get into week two and week three. We'll see consistency prevail.
One of the big things everyone has to remember in season-long or daily fantasy is, especially in football, it's a short season. So you need to have that sort of, to use a football term, the head on a swivel, making sure you're not paying, as you said, Joe, too much attention to what happened in week one, but also trying to get the information right so week two and week three can quickly become positive weeks for you. And the NFL, much the same. Week one is the toughest to gauge, and then hopefully you build from there and can understand more and more as you move forward. But Ben, I want to touch on, I know we did talk about it last week. It seems as though FanDuel and DraftKings are struggling to put together their college slates. They're coming out a little later in the week. There seems to be some confusion about sort of the breakdown of the slates. We see on FanDuel an early, a midday, and then a late slate, and what games are included. Are you finding it difficult to track and to really gauge from a writing standpoint and from an analysis standpoint what games are going to be included and in what slate?
Yeah, I think from a slate to slate perspective, this is one of the more difficult times in general for sites. But I think we're coming out of the gate with a lot of question marks about, how much players are going to play college football and all those little elements that go into making money as a daily fantasy company. It's not all about the players as much as we wish it was. It's not. And so they have to make money, and they're I think initially when they came into this weekend particularly, they both were dropping that 5-6 o'clock game hour and then added it back in when they saw that the other one was throwing a mid-slate in, and now they're doing GPPs. And at first I wasn't going to cover it in the late article, but now I'm starting to throw research in, and I'm including the mid-slate in as well. So it's going to be a full late article, which is going to take me on into late tomorrow night, I'm sure.
Well, Ben, we always appreciate the work. Same with Joe and Jordan that you guys put in. And let's dive into this weekend's, the Saturday slate. As I said, we have this noon sort of start time on FanDuel. We have a 5 o'clock and then an 8 o'clock. And we certainly have some big opportunities for scores. Jordan and Joe and Ben, I know you guys were all talking about the Washington State-Rutgers game. I did have the Rutgers gnomes out last week. I put them away this week. They're not part of the set. But being a Rutgers alum, I know how terrible their secondary is, how young it is. I certainly know plenty to talk about there. But looking at that 12 o'clock slate first, Jordan, seeing the games that are included on both sites, is there a particular game that jumps out at you as a must-have or one that needs to at least be at the forefront of your research as you're starting to get into it?
I mean, you mentioned it, the Washington State-Rutgers game. That's the biggest game that's on both sites. FanDuel has the UMass-Colorado game, which is where a lot of my lineups are coming from on that site, and then DraftKings has Clemson and Appalachian State, which is another good game to target on the Clemson side. But there's not a whole lot of great fantasy potential out of full teams. There are certain players who have individually good matchups, but there's not a whole lot of team stacking potential, in my opinion.
Ben, how about yourself? Any games jumping out at you from this early slate or in your research thus far that has pushed you to write up certain players?
Yeah, I think it's pretty apparent that the UMass, Colorado, and Washington State Rutgers games are going to be the big totals. I actually like Georgia Tech's offense going up against Tulane, who really struggled with not necessarily a similar offense because it's definitely not a triple option, but Duke has a quarterback in Thomas Sirk who had that running threat, and all he did was just pass on him all day long. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Thomas come out throwing a little more than he has. Than he usually does, for sure. And he always has that legs threat. So I think Georgia Tech's going to be an offense I'm going to look at. And there's plenty of other options like Ole Miss against Fresno. I think that's a good slate to go after. And, of course, Ohio State is always a good one, even though they're a 40-point favorite against Hawaii. I think Hawaii covers that.
Hawaii bringing back the old rainbow jerseys for the game with Ohio State. So I'm sure you guys saw that on Twitter. What are they, the Warriors now or whatever they switched to? The Rainbows are back for at least one game. But
they're the Rainbow.
So yeah. Go ahead, Ben.
No, sorry, you're breaking up. They're the Rainbow Warriors. Then they went back, and then, I think they're back to being the Rainbow Warriors to some people.
And Joe, looking at this early slate, if you take us through from a news and notes perspective, what are you from the CFF site? What are you guys focused on? What sort of activity have you seen from these early games from a news perspective that our listeners and viewers should be aware of?
Yeah, a couple of things we'll get into real quick as far as injuries go as well. But, just looking at this early slate as well, I agree with Ben. I think if you're looking wide receiver, that Rutgers-Washington State game just jumps out at you, and Colorado, UMass does as well, between TJ Sharp, Nelson Spruce. I mean, you have a lot of plays right there. The one interesting thing about the early slate for me is you've got some real heavy hitters at running back now. It's interesting to see if anybody jumps on the Alex Collins, the Derrick Henry. You got Ezekiel Elliott. You've got some real heavy hitters there in the early slate. So that'll be really interesting. And look, if something wasn't wrong with Corey Clement's groin, you'd have another heavy hitter up there too. And I think that bears the watching. To me, as the early slate, when looking at those games, that's the one big one that really jumps out at me, because it looks like, from what I'm seeing, that they're going to give him the option to give it a go. From a coaching perspective, I don't see where they're going to need him from Miami of Ohio. And I think if you're looking for a really good, solid play, you might be looking at Dari, and I forget how to pronounce his last name over there at Wisconsin, and Tywan Deal. I think both of those guys are going to get a lot of work over there at Miami of Ohio. I'd be really, really shying away from Corey Clement right now in that early slate. It just scares me too much with that groin injury that I don't think they need him.
Now, gentlemen, we'll go quickly through top plays. As we talked about last week, the write-ups these guys do are in-depth and are all you need for setting your college football lineups. What we're trying to do here is give you a foundation for building and your research. So what we'll do quickly here, guys, for this early slate, Joe just touched on some. Each of you have already mentioned some names. But Ben, if you could, one or two of your top plays, maybe give me a wide receiver and a running back that you're really interested in rostering in this early slate on Saturday.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Alex Collins, who he mentioned, and Derrick Henry, of course. I think they make for really good plays, especially on FanDuel. For the wide receivers, he hit Carew. I think Carew is like pretty much a must play. I like that I get the option of using Clemson versus Appalachian State, and so I might get tempted to run some Artavis Scott out there. But I think your best bet is going to be going in the middle route with your wide receiver. So for me, that's Laquan Treadwell, that's River Craycraft or Dom Williams, that's Shea Fields. Those are the guys that pop out to me as really, really good plays for your wide receivers, and that'll set up you to spend whatever you want on your running backs.
Jordan, if we turn our attention to you, a top player or two from you for this early slate, who you're interested in rostering. I know you touched on a few before. You mentioned the UMass game. Is there one play out of that game that is a focus of your roster construction?
I didn't really look at him a whole lot when I first started researching, but the deeper I dig into the game, I really like Michael Adkins, the Colorado running back. He ran the ball 22 times in the first game, in a game that they lost. So game flow helps them out at all, which they're a 13-point favorite last time I checked. He should see at least 22 carries again against another mediocre run defense. So that's one of my top running backs. And Ben pretty much mentioned all of my favorite wide receivers. I love River Craycraft and just all of the Washington State guys. And Tajay Sharp from UMass. He's 6,900 on FanDuel, which is way too cheap for his skill set.
Certainly, and I touched on it before. I am knee-deep in Rutgers news, being a Rutgers alum, covered the team for a while when I went there. Their secondary is dreadful and is young, is very inexperienced. Two or three of their two of them are currently incarcerated. So that can tend to hurt your depth chart a little bit. So certainly a young defensive backfield for Rutgers will be tested against Washington State. That's going to be a huge number from an over-under perspective, and certainly has shootout written all over it. So offensive pieces on both sides make a lot of sense. Joe, from your perspective, you touched on a couple of guys. Is there one particular play you feel most comfortable with out of these early slate games as a guy you would build a cash lineup around, somebody you feel has a solid floor and a ceiling that may be exploitable?
Yeah, I think there's three guys. I think when you look at Washington State's receivers, sometimes it's a coin flip of what's going to go on. But I'm with you, Ben. When you look at receiver spot, you got Tajay Sharp over there at UMass. You've got Leonte Carew over there at Rutgers, and you've got Nelson Spruth with Colorado. I think those are really three solid plays. And then I'll also give you a couple of red flags, too. And this is where I'm real curious to see what happens this week on how many people may jump on Lamar Jackson of Louisville. Okay, and also Seth Collins over there at Oregon State. Freshman quarterback runs for 150 yards the first week. Everybody's quick to jump on that. But, guys, keep in mind it was against Weber State. And actually, in our article this week, we called the bench Seth Collins this week going up to Michigan. The competition just gets a little tougher, and it sort of brings back the theme a little bit like I mentioned earlier in the show. You can't make too much about week one because of the competition sometimes. So those are the plays I like from a receiver standpoint where I think I'd attach my hitch and a couple of warning signs at the quarterback spot with Lamar Jackson and Seth Collins.
Great stuff on the early slate. Jordan, is there a game here that you're staying away from for any reason? Is there a game that may seem enticing from a high level, but for whatever reason you think is not going to crack your lineup construction this weekend and maybe one worthy of staying away from?
There's a lot of value players in the Oregon State-Michigan game, and they're cheap for a reason because, well, Michigan's defense is legit, as Joe just mentioned, and Oregon State's just a bad team. They're not really good at anything. They're going to struggle all year long. So there are value plays in that game that I wouldn't touch. And The Notre Dame Virginia game, it's two big name schools, obviously, but that's another game that I would not necessarily completely avoid, but it's not something I would target heavily because, again, it's going to be two good defenses. Notre Dame's offense should be towards the top of everything this year, but they don't have Josh Rosen, so I don't know if they can dice up Virginia like he did.
So let's take a look at this midday slate, the afternoon, the late afternoon, the early late slate, whatever we're referring to this 5 p.m. grouping of games as that have been added to this slate. I know research has come and gone on some of these as they continue to be added. Certainly, stay tuned to Fantasy Insiders for the write-ups, for everything, the rankings that these guys put together. If you're not yet a member over on Fantasy Insiders, you can go to fantasyinsiders.com/plans and check out how you can become one. And certainly, any questions you guys have here in chat, we can try to answer as well as we go through this show. I know Ben has already answered what type of wine he's drinking. It is a nice Chianti, from what I understand. So if you have any other questions on wine or beverages, we'll be happy to answer those as well. But if we look at this 5 p.m. slate, Joe, and try to dissect it from a grouping, from the games that are being offered, and I think that's a big part of season long and a big part of daily fantasy, understanding the games that are in front of you and how they should be played and whether or not they should be played. Is this a slate that is enticing to you? Do you see a crop of games for yourself, Joe, that you can understand, be confident in, and make sound choices? Or do you think one of these three slates on Saturday, maybe one just to sit out, and is the midday one one to stay away from?
You know, when I first looked at these three slates, I thought the midday one intrigued me a little bit. I mean, you've got some teams in there that can really put up some points if you're looking for some stacks. I mean, you've got teams like Western Michigan in there. You've got teams like Texas A&M in there. You've got some teams in those slates that can really score some points. And then you also look at that Tennessee-Oklahoma game too, and there's a lot of players you have that you a lot of choices in that game. So it really just comes down to value. But I think there's some really interesting games in that middle slate there. Really tough choices for some guys. I don't think really there's a lot. You know, we talked about Derrick Henry. We talked about Alex Collins really jumping out in that early slate. There's the Tajay Sharps. I don't know if there's as many definites that really jump out at this one, but this could be your slate where you're really going for value, because when you look at teams like Texas A&M, I mean, hey, is it going to be Christian Kirk? Is it going to be Ricky Seals-Jones this week? You know, is it going to be Josh Reynolds? Is it maybe Speedy Noyle shows up? There's just, look at Tennessee, Jalen Hurd. You got Alvin Kamara. You got Samaje Perine. You've got Joe. You've got a ton of talent in these mid-afternoon slates that I think could be tough for some players.
Now, Jordan, as you're going through a daily fantasy perspective on this, so lineup construction, gameplay, picking your games, head-to-heads, whether you play cash or tournaments, is this a slate you feel comfortable with? Is this one you're going to tackle the same way you would any other? Or is this sort of shoehorned in on a college football slate and should be taken a little bit of a different approach to this one?
Yeah, I'm going to approach this slate the same as I would any other slate and post my head-to-heads, get in all my cash games, and then just a couple GPPs. Because I think that with teams like the East Carolina, North Texas, Ball State, teams like that, when those games are in the slate, it provides an edge to the players who are willing to dig deep and do the research and learn about those teams rather than the players who are just going to follow the top 25 and hope to get lucky like that. So anytime that the slate gets bigger or that lesser-known teams are involved, there's a huge edge to be had there.
Obviously, for those watching, Ben has dropped off. We're going to try to figure that out and get Ben back on. If we cannot, we can obviously move forward with the present company and get you guys some top plays for this slate. We'll find Ben, as always, on Twitter at Natural Slugger. It's at the CFF site for Joe. And Jay Case, it's what? The Jordan Case, right? At the Jordan Case?
Yep. Make sure you get that U in there.
Find all
My
these.
name's spelled weird.
Right. As I misspelled his name in our show rundown, I realized after typing it up earlier, but he hasn't threatened me yet, so everything's fine. He won't be getting on a plane to come find me, so I'll be safe. We are continuing on this mid-day slate, and as we construct lineups and as we figure out college football, you guys are talking about edge, right? Talking about knowing these, let's call them smaller schools, and maybe not the best description, but non-Power 5 schools, and that giving the daily fantasy player a bit of an edge over somebody who may be an NFL player and just trying out college football. Jordan, how important is it to you? How important is it, as the picture behind you may fall off the wall, that's fine. How important is it to you to have those games, though? And not from a, hey, greedy standpoint, but just to give you the opportunity to sort of flex your muscle from a college football perspective and really push forward on why you do this research and why you compile the rosters you do.
Yeah, when the games finally got released this week, because both sites took forever, I don't know what the deal was there, but when they finally got released and I looked into the slate and saw that they lacked all of the smaller schools, I kind of got upset because that's, like, a lot of it's just more fun. FanDuel left out the Tulsa and New Mexico game, and that has one of the highest over-unders on the entire slate. I love watching Tulsa play because they just air it out the whole time. And when games like that aren't in here, it makes it less fun. It takes the edge away, and it's just, I think it's a lesser product overall.
We bring back in a dancing Ben, apparently, as he is back and happy to be here. Ben, talking midday slate and talking about this construction of games, do you see a game or games here that you are looking to exploit and ones that you think provide the best matchups for lineup construction?
Yeah, I think the midday slate is going to be actually a better slate to target than the late slate. I wasn't expecting that because I went into this whole thinking, only looking at the late slate, not worried about any of these little 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock games. But they've actually put together quite the nice little set. So, I mean, there's a lot of, like, those big schools playing, like, mid schools, like Pitt versus Akron. I say Western Michigan versus Georgia Southern is actually a game that you get on both sites. That's not normal. Normally, that's like a FanDuel game. This week, you get it on both sites. And so what does that mean, guys? Who do we get to use? Who do we get to use? Come on. Corey Davis. It's Corey Davis, man. Come on. It's Corey Davis. Corey Davis, the guy who lit up Michigan State. We get to use him against Georgia Southern, who just let 2 freshmen go for over 100 yards against them. And so, like, you can't tell me that Georgia Southern's worth a darn without Kevin Ellison as the quarterback, which they won't have him again. So you're talking about an offense from Western Michigan that has Braverman, that has Jarvion Franklin, Terrell, and then it also has Corey Davis. So any of those guys are in play, and I'm going to have at least 2 of them in my cash game lineup because I think that game is so crucial. But I mean, there's a ton of other games I have yet to really dig into yet because I've just started the midweek research tonight. But North Texas SMU is kind of an interesting game because I think people will automatically just look past that one. But with the way Cortland Sutton played against Baylor, man, that guy is fantastic. And for him to push Darius Joseph to like a nothing role, to me says, well, Cortland Sutton's going to be the guy for them. And so I'm excited to see what he does for sure.
My favorite thing about all of these guys is that they're all so cheap. Corey Davis is $7,500 on FanDuel, and Cortland Sutton's only $6,500. So this could be fun.
I think you have Jordan convinced, Ben, that this is a slate that could be a lot of fun. I know he was leaning that way before, but I think you pumped him up enough.
It has Cal too. I mean, this slate has all the fun games.
So, Ben, do you see this as the construction of college football moving forward? Is this the sort of slates we'll see where we have this sort of noon to 4 window, a 5 to 8 window, and then hey, I'm from the East Coast, I'll put it that way. These primetime games that are 8 o'clock Eastern and later?
Dan, I sure hope not, because if that's the way they're going to play it, then it's going to make it difficult on me. Right. Else Jordan's going to be our mid-slate guy. going into the future, because that's what's going to happen. Because, I mean, it's a lot of games to cover. And so I've actually never been I've always been the guy that's going to complain about the sites not getting salaries out soon enough. I'm never going to be a guy that's going to complain about what games they include, because that's just the nature of the beast. They can't include all the games, so they got to decide the way they're going to do it stylistically. I like that DraftKings likes the FCS, and I like that FanDuel likes to do these Mountain West MAC games. I mean, I like the quirkiness of the way they do things. And Draft Street back in the day used to throw in random games. So I'm used to that, and so like when they do these things, I'm not going to complain about it. But they're throwing a mid-slate game in on the Thursday night when all these content providers, I mean, we're not the only ones doing college football anymore. So like, all of us have to deal with throwing together the amount of research it takes to do a good job with college football. I mean, Joe can tell you, he ranks all the freaking games. So when you're doing that, you have to look at so deeply into every single matchup, every single position, every single team. And having only 12 games to do that with on each slate is actually cool with me. Having 30 plus, now you're getting into like an insane amount of guys, and then it becomes more of less of a skill game, I would say. You want to keep the skill aspect of it for sure.
I agree completely, Ben. I mean, look, just jumping on top of that, I think right before you cut out, I was talking about that Western Michigan game. Corey Davis, I mean, he's our number one receiver on the board this week. And then you've got Jarvion Franklin over there who's going to be okay. It looked like he was, what was going on with his head. You can have a stacked lineup, Braverman, Terrell. I couldn't agree with you more. And then even the SMU game, Cortland Sutton, we loved him in the preseason. He was in our freshman to watch. He was in our sleepers. You got to love him. You got to love Matt Davis. I'll even throw another one out there. Paxton Lynch over there at Memphis hits the road to go to Kansas. I see some points scored in that game right there. And look, guys, we talked about UMass earlier in the early slate, right? There's the other team that didn't play in week 1. There's only 2 teams that didn't, UMass and North Texas. Carlos Harris, the receiver down there at North Texas, probably could have a decent game here. They're playing SMU, so it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that guy reach 8 to 10 catches in this game. So those are guys, these obscure games, these are the games that make the college fantasy game great. And I'm assuming in the daily fantasy arena as well, this is what can give you some separation from the those obvious choices like we were talking about in the early slate with the Derrick Henrys and the Alex Collins that jump out at you. You do your homework in slates like this, guys, and that's where you make a difference.
Joe DeSalvo from the CFFsite.com. Obviously, Ben Pritchett and Jordan Case from FantasyInsiders.com. Dan Strafford, myself, also from Fantasy Insiders, bringing you tonight's college football show. We'll be with you every week at 11 Eastern, 10 Central Time to bring you some top plays for the upcoming weekend slate. You'll also be able to find it on iTunes and on YouTube following the conclusion of the show. Certainly glad to be with you. If you guys have any questions in the chat as we are here live on Spreecast, we can answer those as well as we close out the show in a little bit. But if we take a look at this late slate, the 8 p.m. and later on both sites, Ben, let's start with you on this. Actually, Joe, let's start with you. You mentioned rankings, and Ben touched on your rankings as well. Now, you're ranking the whole mess of games here across multiple conferences, and when you come to a slate-specific question, something where you're trying to break down from a DFS perspective, you talked about making the transition from season-long into DFS. When you have this many games and now this late slate on Saturday, are you ranking them today? Or are you looking at them Friday? Are you looking at them during the day Saturday? What's your process over on the CFF site for getting this information out to your users?
Well, what we do is quite simple. Here's the process, guys. I mean, we take a look at what happened all weekend long, and we really have a unique ranking system over here. We don't punch a bunch of numbers in the computer and try to get them to spit out to us. We really look at every game individually, and we go ahead and start slotting. And we just start slotting players, and it's a tedious process. So, we get our waiver wire out there on Monday. This was a late week this week, obviously, with the Labor Day game. But Monday's the day we hit our waiver wire, and then Tuesday we start getting into the rankings to release them on Wednesday. We're a little late this week because of the late week. And then, like tonight, we threw up start bench. We'll throw some emergency starters up on Friday. And where that's really important, that's more for the seasonal players, but I think it helps DFS players as well because those are some guys that we throw up there. guys that play in real deep seasonal leagues that they play in these deep leagues and they need some names, some of those needles in the haystack, if you will. And I think those are the low value guys as well for the DFS players too. So I think we rank so many players out. We don't give you numbers. We don't crunch numbers, but we look at everybody comparatively, and that's how we come up with a real unique ranking system. We don't just slot them into certain levels. So that's how we go ahead and do the process over here, and it does take a couple of days to do that.
So, Joe, piggybacking on that and maybe driving this point home, you talk about injuries, you talk about these rankings, emergency starters. Obviously, in the NFL, the NBA, all these sports in DFS, injuries create opportunity, and opportunity creates points, and points create cash. So in this instance of the 8 p.m., are there injuries? Are there potential depth chart changes? Easy for me to say, but potential depth chart changes at these 8 p.m. games that you're keeping an eye on for the CFF site that may be potential for some cheap options that may be moving up the depth chart?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really see, as far as when I look at the late slate, there aren't really a lot of injuries, a lot of guys out there where you're really on the borderline of should I make the call? Let me just point out, since I am on you guys' program for the first time, there's a rule of thumb that I have, and I think for college fantasy, when we're talking injuries compared to the NFL, NFL is sort of easy. It's either active, inactive, they're playing or they're not, and most of the time, if they're active, you're going to get a full, you're going to get a full 60 minutes from them. College injuries, they're not that easy to come by. The news is not that easy to come by, and the player pool is usually so deep that the rule of thumb is that if there's a question of whether or not the player is going to play or not, I have always suggested to scratch him and look somewhere else, because you're better off getting somebody with a similar value, maybe not as great number, then that's better than taking a goose egg. So that's my rule of thumb when it comes to injuries. I don't see a lot here on the late slate that's going to come into play. I think your homework's going to come in as far as value plays goes. But for future reference, if ever you see that there's a questionable call involved, I've always advised people to just err with caution, stay away, and find another option, because you can't afford a goose egg.
That makes a lot of sense. Jordan, let's come your way. This late slate, what games are jumping out at you? Which ones do you like from a lineup construction perspective? And if you want, Jordan, maybe loop in here from your line perspective, the story, the column you're writing each week. Are there any lines here you see or potential for line movement, or whatever you're really focusing on there in this late slate of games that is worth keeping an eye on?
Shocker that the first thing I noticed about this slate was UCLA and Josh Rosen, and this ties into the line movement. UCLA opened at minus 28, has since moved to minus 30, and the over/under has moved from 63.5. It was up to 66 earlier today. It is down to 65.5 now. But that game, I could easily see UCLA just going nuts on a terrible defense like UNLV. So there's some stacking potential there, even though they might only play 3.5 quarters. The rest of the slate, Oregon and Michigan State, looks like a good game. You can play pretty much anyone from that game, in my opinion. Both offenses will be able to move the ball, especially Oregon. And then Indiana is another team that I look at with some stack potential. Nate Sudfeld, I think, is a pretty underrated quarterback from a fantasy perspective. And Jordan Howard, the UAB transfer, came over and lit it up last week and should have the same opportunity to do so this week.
Ben, how about yourself? What are you looking at from this late slate? And any games or specific players? And remember, write-ups are over on FantasyInsiders.com, but any specific players you're staying away from in this late slate? Guys that you think may be overpriced, or guys you feel like are no-goes for ceiling or floor issues?
Yeah, staying away from is an interesting question. I think the one game you want to stay away from is like the Temple-Cincinnati game. I mean, you're going to get drawn in by the fact that maybe you think Temple can put up some points against Cincinnati. And I understand that if you're going after Anderson on DraftKings, where he's only like 3.8K, he's a good little punt option at the wide receiver slot. But other than that, like, I'm not really enticed by Cincinnati after seeing Temple play so well against – I mean, I know we're all going to say Penn State sucks. and their offense sucks. But to their defense, it was strong enough last year, and it was strong enough in that first game to where I'm not really going to risk Keel and all that on all those wide receivers. Just too many balls to go around in that offense, too many running backs. There's just nothing that really jumps out and says, oh, this is a stable option and you want to go after it. Now, I'll tell you a guy that I'm really interested in seeing, and he might be maybe too risky for the normal person, but when it comes to like a GPP strategy or just a talent, Jonathan Gray is only 6,300 on FanDuel, and he's going up against Rice. So I'm seeing this whole Texas offense, they come off of that really terrible performance. I could see them bounce back and basically let Jonathan Gray lead them into the attack. Now, if anybody played with Texas players last year, you used Malcolm Brown and you got disappointed more times than you were rewarded for doing that. I think Jonathan Gray's a better back, and I also think Jonathan Gray could have a good performance in this game on a slate that doesn't have a ton of good options. I mean, Jordan brought up UCLA. Now, UCLA, I think the way to attack that game isn't necessarily to go after Rosen. I think it's going to be going after Perkins or Soso Jamebo, who had 9 carries for 80 yards.
You just wanted to say Soso.
I was squeezing that in. That's the wine talking. Any chance I get to say Soso. No, but seriously, so like if he comes in and mop up duty in that game like he did last week, well, I mean, it wasn't really mop up duty against Virginia, but I mean, just the fact that he's getting carries and if he gets work late in that game against a really bad run defense for the past 2 years, like that's a game that I want to attack with rushers. But Michigan State against Oregon, that can be a sneaky wide receiver play because they were just getting torched by Eastern Washington last week.
So my challenge to every college football writer out there is to work in your best orange is the new black reference for Soso Jamebo. Obviously, Soso a character. If I have to explain it, it's not going to be as funny, but fine.
You just did.
We can move on from there. It's over. It's fine. This is what happens. It's dad life.
Joe knows so is up again because you just ruined the show.
There you go.
There it is.
There we go.
There you go. There you go. There you go. No, look, the one thing about this late slate that's really interesting to me is there's when we were looking at the midday and early slate, the midday specifically, I mean, there was a couple we didn't even mention on there. I think Arizona and Nevada's even on there, and I don't even think we even mentioned that one. So, I mean, that's another midday slate as well. This late slate, I see a bunch of defense on the board. There's going to be some really obscure plays that I think low-value plays that are really going to separate the cream from the crop in this. I mean, you've got LSU. You've got Central Florida playing Stanford, right? I mean, you've got USC taking on Idaho. There's a lot of, Temple's defense. I mean, look, Penn State may not be that good, but they got sacked 10. I mean, Temple's defense is respectable. There's a lot of defense in this late slate. It'll be really interesting to see where some of the plays come. Do guys jump on a Josh Rosen, or is this the week that Paul Perkins comes back into play because now everybody knows what Josh Rosen does? Those are the type of decisions you're going to have to make based on what you're doing with your lineup. But those are the type of decisions this week that I really see what's going to separate a lot of folks. Do you jump on Rosen? Do you jump on Perkins? Are you going to stack them? Or are you not? I think that's what's going to – those type of decisions I know always come into play, but I just don't see a lot of games on this slate where there's going to be separation. It may come down to just a simple decision as that one.
All right, gentlemen, we'll go around quickly on this one, and it's a simple question. If you are an average DFS player, meaning somebody who doesn't have the time to research, doesn't have the rankings, doesn't have the ability, which slate are you playing of these three? If you have one slate you have to choose, which one do you feel most comfortable with from a possibility of building a good cash game lineup and building maybe a secondary GPP lineup? So, Jordan, first to you. Of these three, the noon, the 5, and the 8 p.m., which slate do you feel most comfortable with as you're looking through them?
The slate that I feel the most comfortable with is that the middle slate. But I think from just an average fan perspective coming in, trying it for the first time, the early slate would be the best place for them to start out because it has the teams that they know. They don't have to do a ton of in-depth research. But for the people who have the time, definitely get on that middle slate.
Joe, how about yourself? Which of these three slates of games do you think bodes best for building lineups you're comfortable with and developing maybe a GPP lineup or two that you would have confidence in?
Well, you know what? If I'm someone that's really new to it, I'm liking the early slate just because there's more teams in there that I think I'm familiar with. You've got the Alabamas, you got the Ohio States, you got some of the big boys in there. You know, some of the big name running backs that we've looked at. You know, when you think of fantasy, just in general, most average fantasy players are saying, "Where are the running backs? Those are the guys I have to target." So if I'm in that mindset right now, I'm looking more so in the early slate.
And Ben, how about yourself? For you, let's change it up a little for Ben. For you, which are you choosing? I know you have had to write all three, but if you got to choose which one you were going to write and only write one, which one would it have been?
Okay. If I got to choose, I haven't written the mid slate, but I have a feeling that would be the one I would have chosen if they had given it to me on Tuesday. But because I'm getting it tonight, I don't really want to write it, so it's not going to be the one I choose. I'm going to choose the one I already wrote and it's done. That's the early slate. And actually, I really stand by that. I think if you're playing GPPs, which is where I tend to like to play, they give me a hard time because I don't like playing cash games. I don't like playing head-to-heads and putting a lot of money out.
By they, the Slack chat for Fantasy Insiders. So just to give
they
context.
being the other co-founders and some other vagrants, they know who they are, that hang around Fantasy Insiders chats. Those are the guys that would give me a hard time about just playing GPPs. But I actually think that in the early slate, like Joe was saying, there's teams to target, and therefore makes it a better GPP type atmosphere because you're able to grab a team, roll with it, build a base, and take those big running backs. Like I made 4 teams. I already have 4 teams built, and all 4 of them have sick running backs, like ridiculously good running backs. So I was able to build with the quarterbacks I'll give you my 4 quarterbacks. Justin Thomas. I have Lamar Jackson team. I have a Falk team, and I have a LaFau team. So Colorado, Washington State, a Louisville, and then a Georgia Tech. So like I think that's how you're going to have to attack it. It's a multi-lineup type slate, but I like those kind of slates.
So the one question in the chat from earlier, from Doug, like Lamar Jackson in the early slate, ? Jordan, to you, and you guys can all chime in before we sign off on tonight's show. Lamar Jackson, early slate, ? Jordan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think he's an option. I think, what is his price? He's $5,800 on FanDuel, which is a really nice price tag for a guy who has dual threat ability. He has all of the upside in the world. But it's a tough matchup against Houston, who I want to say they were top 10 in the country last year in forcing turnovers. And that's just not a defense that I like to target when they can just keep the ball out of the quarterback's hands or even take it out of the quarterback's hands. That kind of scares me.
Joe, where does he rank if you have those rankings handy? Where does Lamar Jackson rank going into Saturday's contest?
Well, we've got Lamar Jackson just inside the top 50. I'd love to be able to put him higher with his dual threat ability. The problem is with Petrino, sometimes you just never know. You never know if a guy's going to get a hook. And I'm going to tell you right now, not only if I'm playing seasonal or if I'm playing daily, I need to know that this guy's going to be in there and he's going to lead the team for 60 minutes, man. He gets a quick hook because some screwball turnover that he has, and then all of a sudden you're on the line. But here's a name I'll throw at you that I haven't mentioned earlier that in this game, and I'm glad this guy brought it up, so thank you. There's a guy that I really like, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here. DeMarcus Ayers at Houston. Remember that name, guys. He had 10 catches last week. He rushed the ball 4 times. He does punt returns as well. He seems like he's doing it all in that new offense over there at Houston. I'm really curious I'm really going to keep an eye on this guy for you seasonal players, and that might be somebody you look at. I don't know what his price is right now in DFS, but that could be a sneaky play for you right there. DeMarcus Ayers, Houston, wide receiver.
And Ben, before we go, your thoughts on Lamar Jackson and any other guys you feel necessary to mention before we say goodnight and post this to iTunes and over on YouTube as well.
And first of all, I like listening to Joe talk about DeMarcus Ayers with such fervor and enthusiasm. It's getting late here, so I like when I'm just like, how is he pulling this out of wherever he's pulling it from?
Man, I got more, but you guys don't want to go for another hour. I got more.
Well, we used to take the show into the wee hours of the morning, but now we're more structured with Dan running the ship as opposed to Soccer Dave. But no, I think with Lamar Jackson, you've got a guy. I watched tape on him. I mean, I like watching tape on players, especially freshmen. And in high school, he ran a pistol, which is really surprising. And I wrote this up in the write-up about him, is that a guy who runs the pistol would choose Petrino. But he throws the ball really freaking well. And I mean, like arm strength wise, I don't know how accurate he is, but he has that like arm strength that brings in the Teddy Bridgewater comparisons that I'd hate to have to deal with, but that's the way it is. I mean, to think that Petrino thought so much of the guy to throw him in a trick play in the very first play of the game last week. He threw an interception, but then put him back in at the end of the second quarter, and he went on to have a decent game and rush for over 100 yards. So, like, against Auburn. So, like, he comes into this matchup. I don't actually think that this Houston defense is as good as last year's. They lost a lot of their front seven, a lot of their best players. And whereas, like, you should be worried about turnovers, and that would be the thing that I would worry about. I actually think he's going to run a little bit. So, running quarterbacks kind of can mitigate turnovers by the ability to run. And in DFS, interceptions are like a negative 1 point. So, like, that's not really that much. So as long as he stays in the game, which I think he will, I actually think they'll move Bonifon to a wide receiver spot, which they need help out there. So I think it's his job to take off with from now on for sure.
Gentlemen, great content. Joe, maybe we can sign up for an hour number 2 next week. We'll figure that out and make sure we bottle what you got, because I could use some of it over here too. Certainly,
we got some coffee, guys. I'm ready to go.
Or I guess cup it is the better way to put it, not bottle it.
There you go.
Cup it in some way, shape, or form. You can find Jordan on Twitter, The Jordan Case, the CFF site for Joe DeSalvo, and Natural Slugger for Ben. Obviously, all the content over on FantasyInsiders.com. Don't forget to check out the GPP if you're interested in a podcast on a daily format. And, of course, the Blueprint, which will help you construct your NFL lineups, available on iTunes as well. With all that said, we wish you the best of luck on Saturday. Stay tuned to Fantasy Insiders for all the content you need for your DFS lineup building this Saturday and every Saturday of the college football season. Have a great night, guys. We'll see you again next week.